Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Yes Labels podcast. I'm Justin Clark with Bill Stepien. If you like this podcast, subscribe to it, like it, leave comments. Leave comments even if you don't like it. With that, we'll jump right in. Talk about and analyze the news of the day in presidential and national politics, and really get into what's going on in the world. We are we're in interesting times, and like we always say, there's going to be tons of news all the way through the 2024 presidential election. We can't. It's hard to get used to it all starting this early, but I guess that's the world we live in.
President Trump, earlier this week, he announced that he received a little special delivery from Washington, D.C., a little envelope in the mail from the special counsel at the DOJ. There's obviously a big legal component to the said target letter, but I saw you quoted in the New York Times talking about what it means by way of the presidential primary, the politics of it all. Tell me more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I was quoted in an article. I was asked about, why former President Trump, what this indictment means for the Republican primary. And there's been a lot of talk about how, does this help him? Does it hurt him? And the reality is it kind of goes deeper than that. He has one thing that people miss about this. Everyone looks at the horse race, right? Everyone looks at the ballot number of who's winning, who's losing. The important thing to remember in this is that President Trump, regardless of what his ballot number is, remains very popular with the Republican base. He's arguably the most popular Republican politician in the country. Republican voters like him. And what happens when you like him? We live in a world where people get defensive about people they like. It's human nature, for one thing. But people who are allies, people who are friends, people who you like, people who are close to you, when they get attacked, then they feel attacked, and they want to come to that person's defense.
Is this like,
and whether it's another politician?
Is this like you can't talk bad about I can talk bad about my brother, but you can't?
Exactly right. People have grown to know him over the years. This is more than just, oh yeah, I like him or I don't like him. With all the stuff that's gone on in the last 7 years with him and with everybody else, all that stuff has made people develop a relationship with him. More than just a favorable or unfavorable number, a relationship. People like other politicians, but they've developed a relationship with Donald Trump. And so what happens is when he's attacked, and let's be honest, there's been some public polling out there where, regardless of whether people think Donald Trump is guilty of a crime or not, regardless of that, people feel like these are political charges against him. So if another politician or a legal entity, the Department of Justice or a state prosecutor, attacks him or comes after him, people get defensive about it. And so it's not just the ballot number, it's that people have an affinity for him. They've developed a relationship with him, and they feel attacked when he's attacked. So is it going to help his polling numbers? Yes, it is, especially in a Republican primary. So I think, getting back to like the overall picture of a target letter from the DOJ, you've got multiple prosecutions going on already, potentially more. And right now we don't see the voting public, especially in Republican primaries, differentiating between the three. That's I don't see this hurting him in any way, and it probably does help him.
Yeah, well said. And obviously that's they've mastered the art of fundraising around moments like this. And many people are saying, as President Trump often says himself, that the timing of his release of the news certainly impacted the news cycle this week a little bit too.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, Bill. We talked a lot about Ron DeSantis and his campaign last week, and it sounds like there was a little bit of a shakeup after we talked. Why don't you talk about that shakeup for a little bit?
We did have a lot to say about the governor in episode 1, largely are comments focused on his need to run a more focused campaign, to put a lot more meat on the messaging bones, to get away from the process nonsense like talking about fundraising figures or droning on about numbers of door knockers. And a strange thing happened. He listened, right? Earlier in the week, he rolled out his military policy. A lot of people had things to say about what was contained within the policy, but he rolled out policy, which is a rarity for the governor's campaign. And then he went on TV to talk about it with Jake Tapper. It was almost like what a real campaign does, right? You roll out a policy, then you go talk about it, you go sell it. He talked about Ukraine and China and abortion while on Tapper's show. And so that was, applause for the governor on that front. That was evidence of him running a more focused campaign and talking about things that Republican primary voters actually want to hear. To your point about the air quotes here, shakeup, you all know there's been a lot of grumbling that he's been hearing from the donor class, unhappy with the performance of their investment as the governor's poll numbers stay mostly stuck in neutral. I think, and this is my theory, just having been a part of a lot of campaigns over the years and campaigns trying to be responsive to their donor class. I think this week to appear to be responsive to the cranky rich people, to calm them down, but let's be honest, mostly to get their checks. His team made some mostly low and mid-level staff changes. And I think they're trying to sell that as some sort of big campaign reset or some big campaign reboot. And let's be honest, that didn't happen. These were minor changes. These were mostly cosmetic changes. They reminded me of when, and the New York Yankees just did this, it reminds me of when a baseball team fires their hitting coach. The hitting coach has little impact on the outcome of the game. It's something that management does so they can point to evidence of trying to make a positive change, even though it's largely cosmetic. This is usually done by management to save their own jobs before they're inevitably fired at some point, which, may happen at some point in the campaign here too.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I just want to touch on that a little bit because I think it's really, and I apologize. There's some background noise. We're both tying in remotely today. So apologies to all you, Yes Labels podcast fans. The really interesting part to me, Bill, is that going to satisfy the bloodlust of donors out there who were kind of clamoring for a change? It might be too early to tell. I mean, we're seeing some reporting, but what do you think?
Yeah, look, Trump had multiple campaign managers, each of his, the two times he's run. Time will tell, what happens in his third run. But I spent a lot of time on the phone with donors every single day when I took over as campaign manager in July of 2020. I made myself a list of 5-10 calls each day to check in and give status reports with the people who were opening up their checkbooks to the campaign. I asked their opinions. I got their feedback. Sometimes I took it, sometimes I didn't. But these folks were heard, and that was a big deal for them. So, poll numbers are what they are, and it's the job of the campaign manager, the job of the campaign and the candidate to keep the investors of said campaign happy and content and remaining invested. I think that's what this was largely, but this was not. This was sold, trying to be sold by the campaign as some sort of big reset, big reboot. It wasn't. This was minor. This was cosmetic. This won't make much of a change.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that.
Yeah. Other than President Trump's mail, other than the fake reboot by Governor DeSantis' campaign, any other news of note over the last couple of days that you want to touch on? Anything going on that you think warrants discussion?
Yeah, the two big ones in the news that I noticed were first, all the candidates except for former President Trump gathered in Iowa at a evangelical summit, evangelical voters being very important in Iowa, obviously for the caucuses. And they all did a forum individually, not with everyone on stage at the same time, that Tucker Carlson hosted. And to say that Tucker it was full Tucker Carlson would be an understatement. He really got into it with the candidates, and one clip in particular here with former Vice President Pence is one that I just want to highlight. Why don't we play that?
Sorry, Mr. Vice President, have you? I know you're running for president. You are distressed that the Ukrainians don't have enough American tanks. Every city in the United States has become much worse over the past 3 years. Yeah. Drive around. There's not one city that's gotten better in the United States. And it's visible. Our economy has degraded. The suicide rate has jumped. Public filth and disorder and crime have exponentially increased. Right. And yet your concern is that the Ukrainians, a country most people can't find on a map, who've received tens of billions of U.S. tax dollars, don't have enough tanks. Right. I think it's a fair question to ask, like, where's the concern for the United States in that?
Well, it's not my concern. Tucker, I've heard that routine from you before, but that's not my concern.
All right. So that was really bad.
Yikes.
Okay. Yeah, that was really bad. And I've got a lot of respect for Vice President Pence. We've both worked with him over the years.
Good man.
And to be honest, his answer at the end kind of gave some context to his statement right there. But the problem is, in a clippable statement that made its way all around the internet, it was really not great when he is responding cadence-wise to Tucker Carlson's litany of problems in the United States with saying, that's not my concern. That's not my concern. There was definitely a better way to answer that. But go ahead.
Yeah. Do you read into Donald Trump not appearing at this conference as any sort of predictive play on whether he's going to show up at future debates in the coming weeks?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to say what he's going to do or not going to do. His team right now is presumably making the pro and con arguments on everything. Just me,
but he's got that luxury, right? But
he's the only luxury. He's the only one who has that luxury.
Someone like Mike Pence doesn't have that luxury. They need to show up. They need to, wade into waters like he probably or hopefully expected Tucker was going to, draw him into, that weren't going to be easy or great for him. But seeing where he's at in the polls, he didn't have the luxury of not showing up and avoiding the tough questions.
Correct. They all do. Donald Trump's unique in that sense, is he's the only one who can avoid this and not do these types of events or not go on the debate stage. And frankly, there's a potential significant downside for him going on the debate stage, being, hey, am I gonna elevate everybody else by appearing on stage with them? So that's a big major risk for him as he decides whether he's going to do this debate or not. But he can avoid problematic or troubling statements like Mike Pence had, that other candidates just can't avoid. It's the luxury of having 100% name ID and having that kind of relationship with Republican voters that he has, that he can do that. So there's potential downsides to him showing up, and he just doesn't need to. But everybody else does.
Also, some less than great fundraising numbers released by the vice president's campaign this week, right?
Yeah, they raised just north of $1 million in the second quarter of the year, which is problematic because that includes his launch date and launch time. And look, there are other candidates like Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson, others who put up pretty poor numbers too. But it was striking with the former vice president, because that number really matters to him. And if he's good, he's got to get on the debate stage. And as we know, the Republican National Committee has put certain indicia of, you know, of being able to get on, and one of them is the number of donors. And so it's a real concern, and it's a real concern, frankly, with that kind of cash to be able to deliver a message. So TBD if he can turn that around in any way. But that was not a great number. But speaking of numbers, Senator Tim Scott this week announced, or his super PAC announced, I should say, Tim PAC, announced that they would be reserving $40 million worth of airtime in the early states. That's a significant amount of money. And he's a guy who we haven't talked about on this podcast, but definitely has a lane to be able to capture a lot of that evangelical vote, especially in a state like Iowa. It's a significant amount of money. We've checked with our TV buyers. They're actually laying down quite a bit of that money. So just for those who don't know, making a reservation for a television buy doesn't mean you actually bought it. You make a reservation to reserve the time and get it locked in, but then you actually have to like pay for it and ship an ad, and that doesn't always happen. People sometimes try to play games with this stuff, but that doesn't appear to be the case here. Tells us, I think, and Bill, you tell me if you disagree, that Tim Scott's here to play. His super PAC is gonna spend, and you can be sure in the coming weeks and months they are going to make a broad appeal, and he's going to personally make a broad appeal to evangelical voters in Iowa. But you know, it's a significant buy, and it was significant news, and it made news. But that was a pretty striking number this week.
It's a big deal, and he's got, you know, Larry Ellison. He's got a guy and a couple heavy hitters behind him, and that makes a big difference. The vice president, I'm not sure he does. He doesn't have that anchor, which really helps make the thing go, which is very, very problematic for him.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Now, look, a lot of the focus here has been we've talked a lot about Iowa. Obviously, it comes first in the nation, and every year it's always a little different about what matters and what doesn't. But that early schedule has been relatively stable over the last, I don't know, 30 years. Bill, what's your take on how the puzzle pieces fit together for the early states this year, and like what matters more than what doesn't, just at the moment?
Well, yeah, you said things have been relatively stable. I'm actually going to say there have been a couple of changes that are notable, and I think have been underreported in the early states. Two big changes. The first one is the time window. In 2016, the first four states, and I say 2016 because that was the last real contested primary. There wasn't one in 2020 in Trump's reelection, of course. But in 2016, the first four states all held their first caucuses and primaries within 22 days. 22 days, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada all ran, just over 3 weeks. This year, or next year, in 2024, it's not 22 days, it's 40 days. And that's not a small deal. I mean, it seems like 18 days, what's the big deal? But for a campaign, and we've sat in that campaign manager's chair, we know what this is like. It's an extra 18 days of airing TV ads, right? As campaigns begin to run out of money. And for underperforming campaigns who underwhelm or disappoint in Iowa or New Hampshire, that's an extra 18 days of answering reporters' annoying questions about why they're losing. That's an extra 18 days of trying to keep staff and volunteer morale high in campaign headquarters or in field offices in those early states. That's an extra 18 days of trying to spin donors that all is well, as we just discussed, and to send more checks, even though the numbers aren't great and that we're losing. So that's an extra tough 18 days. And even for a winning campaign, for someone that wins Iowa or surprises in a good way, that's an extra 18 days of avoiding mistakes and landmines and trying to maintain that momentum for an extra 18 days.
So
I talked about.
So what does that? What does that mean? What does that mean for Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina? Like, does it make it more important? What states matter because of that?
Well, I was always, you're going to tell me that I think that Iowa always matters. I'm going to tell you Iowa doesn't matter unless there's a particular outcome. To me, Iowa is like, what's Iowa like? I'm a college basketball fan. Iowa is like the preseason rankings that come out before the season starts, right? People pay a lot of attention to the preseason rankings. People think it matters because nothing else is going on. And then what happens? Games start, action starts. And after a while, once that happens, you look back at those preseason rankings and say, we were way off. They were way off. Why did we ever pay attention to those in the first place? Think about what's happened in Iowa in the last contested primaries. Again, putting aside 2020 wasn't contested. The caucuses, rather. 2008, who wins Iowa? Mike Huckabee. What good did winning Iowa do Mike Huckabee in 2008? It catapulted Mike Huckabee in New Hampshire to 11% in third place. And he was out of the race, out of the election the first week of March. Santorum wins Iowa in 2012. And he rode that massive Iowa momentum wave to New Hampshire, where he won 9% in New Hampshire a week later. He was then third place in South Carolina 2 weeks after that, and he was out of the race a few weeks later in early April. 16, we paid a lot of attention to 16. Big surprise, everyone thought Trump was going to win. Ted Cruz wins. Huge win for Senator Cruz. He rode that upset into New Hampshire, where he came in a distant third. Justin, he came in third place behind Donald Trump and John Kasich. I don't think Iowa generally matters this time around, unless Donald Trump wins. If Donald Trump wins, if the front runner wins and he snuffs out any potential surprise and he leaves Iowa with a win, then he's off to the races. And it actually matters.
So I actually think, I do disagree with you. I think it does matter. And to use your college basketball analogy, these aren't the preseason rankings. This is the play-in game to get into the tournament. We saw UCLA go to the Final Four a couple of years ago from the play-in game. If you don't perform in Iowa, you don't get to play the rest of the game. All of those folks you mentioned, with the exception of Huckabee, and I don't remember really what happened in 2008, but in 2012, at the end of the campaign, the end of the primary campaign, which lasted for several months because Romney had a lot of difficulty catching up, who was the race between? Romney and Santorum. Santorum got very close in Michigan and Ohio. I would argue that he should have stayed in Pennsylvania because he probably could have won that. It's all retrospect. At the time, I wasn't in the middle of it, so I'm not trying to criticize anybody. But he was there at the end and fighting. Same with 2016. Ted Cruz.
Don't forget,
the guy.
Ron Paul was a close third in 2012 in Iowa. Behind, he was nipping at its heels in 2012. Ron Paul.
Who had juice at the 2012 convention to be able to get to a point where they had to change the rules so that he couldn't get some of his stuff put in the platform? Ron Paul.
Okay, but we're talking about.
Let me finish.
We're talking about the party nominee, not the convention rules. I know.
No, but my point is this:
but
you're saying Iowa doesn't matter. I'm saying Iowa sets the table for what the rest of the primary race is going to look like throughout the rest of the primary race, and I think that's what's going to happen this year. I think that you're going to have, if Donald Trump wins Iowa, the second place person is the person who's going to run and be with him in South Carolina. And that's where the fight's going to take place. That's where the final battle will take place. I'd argue New Hampshire doesn't matter this time around more than Iowa, because Iowa's going to set the table for what South Carolina and the rest of the Super Tuesday states look like.
We should ask President Huckabee and President Santorum and President Cruz just how much Iowa matters. I actually went back and looked. Since 1972, just 43% of the Republican winners of the Iowa caucus have gone on to win the party's nomination. Iowa is less accurate than a coin flip, assuming President Trump wins. That's my thought.
In your overwhelming universe of 13, a lot of whom had re-elections going on. Look, Iowa sets the table. We can agree to disagree on this, and I think it's going to matter more this year than most, frankly, because it's whoever comes in second in Iowa is the person who's going to keep going, and I think that's going to matter. It's going to matter quite a bit. So
I want to go back. Let me go back to the second. I mentioned the first change in the time window, which I think 22 days this year or next year, 24, versus 40 days in 2016. I think that's a big deal. Do you agree with that, by the way? Do we have at least some agreement on that? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a huge deal. And I think, now, not to get back to the other argument, I think it makes Iowa matter more because fundraising is going to increase for the people that do better in that place, so they'll have more money to play a little bit longer. But make your points. I think it's a good one.
The second big change before I want to get to the states again, keep going. But the second big change is the order. And there was it looks like a minor change, but I want to hear your thoughts. I don't think it's a minor change. In 2016, the order of the first four states was Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. In 2024, Iowa first again, New Hampshire first or second again, then it's Nevada, then it's South Carolina. South Carolina this cycle, 2024, will be after Nevada for the first time since 2008 when they both voted on the same day. I don't think that's a minor change. And here's why I think that, Justin. I think, one, we saw this working on both Trump campaigns. We saw this in the White House. Nevada is Trump country. In 2016, Trump won 46% in the Nevada early state contest. That was his best performance of any of the early states, and even for a while thereafter. So that puts another early win in Trump's column, or I expect it to at least, and maybe more importantly, keeps everyone else off the board in the early states. And I also think maybe more importantly for other candidates, this is really bad news for Tim Scott, who we've been talking about, and Nikki Haley, because the shorter the time window between Iowa and their home state of South Carolina, the better. And it's longer now. And now you're adding another state before South Carolina goes too, which is likely going to make Tim Scott and Nikki Haley 0 for 3 headed into South Carolina. And those 40 days between Iowa and South Carolina are going to seem like 40 lifetimes for them. And I know you're going to tell me, that Joe Biden went 0 for 3 and then won in South Carolina.
No,
that was an extreme rarity and unlikely to happen again. But what do you think about that?
Then the Democratic primaries aren't that way. Look, either Nikki Haley or Tim Scott's going to survive. Well, let me put it this way: both of them aren't going to survive through to the South Carolina primary. But one of them will be out, and maybe two of them will be out by then. I agree with that. I think that change matters, but there's that. It's kind of interesting. Nevada has traditionally been a caucus state. Has traditionally been a caucus state, but the state of Nevada shifted it to a primary system beginning in 2024. So while I think Donald Trump probably still performs very well in Nevada, there's not only a change in the date, but kind of a change in the process of how they're going to vote. Now, I know the Nevada Republican Party is contesting that and suing on that. I don't know what'll happen with it. I haven't seen an update on it, but that will certainly change how it works and probably allow for a little bit more campaigning. That was as you know, Nevada is very heavily centered in terms of votes in Clark County, which is Las Vegas, and having an open primary versus a caucus will matter. But I think you're right. I don't anticipate Donald Trump being anything but first place in Nevada, and I think it'll be a very interesting thing to see what these campaigns do, because if I'm a Tim Scott or a Nikki Haley or heck even a Mike Pence or anybody that comes in second in Iowa, they're going to have a pretty interesting decision to make, because instead of just saying, hey, I'm going to skip New Hampshire because I'm fighting in South Carolina, which is a perfectly reasonable thing. It's a lot harder to skip 2 states to try to make it to the next one.
No doubt.
But
no doubt.
Yeah. So this switching it to a primary instead of a caucus actually makes it even harder to skip it, for that matter, because of the caucus system in Nevada. It's not like the Iowa caucuses where you've just got tons of caucus sites spread over the entire state. It's just much smaller than that. So I agree with you that length matters, but I also think that because it's a money play too, and having the money to keep going on, you're right. You gotta win and then you advance. You gotta win, then you advance. That whoever comes in second or is viewed as the competitor to Donald Trump coming out of Iowa is going to be able to have the resources to play going forward. So, and let's not discount New Hampshire in this either. New Hampshire is going to have its say, and if the race starts forming up into 2 groups of people, that person, depending on who it is, could get a real pop coming out of Iowa.
Is obviously Trump needs to win Iowa because he's up in the real clear politics average right now of a 24-point lead as it stands now. Is Iowa most important to Mike Pence and Tim Scott, or do you have a different view?
I think so. I think, frankly, either of them could perform in New Hampshire. So traditionally, it's always been said that you go from one of the most religious voting blocks in the country in Iowa to one of the least religious voting blocks in the country in New Hampshire. And people will kind of play to that religious base in Iowa and will be a turnoff to people in New Hampshire. I think it's TBD with respect to Mike Pence and Tim Scott. They don't, this isn't Pat Robertson in 1988. Heck, it's not even Rick Santorum in 2012. They're different. They've got a broader appeal, I think, at this moment. So they may play in New Hampshire, and that could change the equation too.
64% of Iowa caucus goers in 2016 identified as evangelicals or born again Christians. 64%.
Yeah.
And it seems like Pence has or had been stuck in neutral. I don't think he's going to be helped by Tucker and his appearance at the Iowa Candidates Forum. Doesn't have money to spend his way out of this problem. And look, he's also at universal name ID, 100% name ID, and he's not moving. So it's not like he's still in the process of introducing himself to voters. Tim Scott is. Tim Scott, you're seeing movement in Iowa for him. He's got room to grow since a lot of voters don't know him. May, June, and July, he's grown his numbers from 1% to 3% to 7%. And at the same time, DeSantis has, in those 3 months, gone from 26 to 24 to 21. So we'll see if those numbers keep growing for Scott, because they need to, as you say, make their way to New Hampshire.
And I will say this: he's in a unique position, right? Like those evangelical voters you referenced, they're going to coalesce around somebody, and Tim Scott's a natural landing place for them. So if the former Vice President Pence, doesn't kind of correct what he's doing, those voters will start coalescing around Tim Scott, and he has the luxury of being able to kind of just hang around right now while his super PAC does a lot of the legwork introducing him to voters, and he personally is in Iowa introducing himself to voters. There will come a moment, and I don't know when that is, where he's got to make a stand and say something about something. I don't know what it is. It's a very generic term, but he's going to have to distinguish himself from the PAC and, really kind of like we talked about last week with Ron DeSantis, like make news about something. That time isn't right now, but he's putting himself in a position where he can take advantage of that moment when it happens.
Well, look, after Iowa will come New Hampshire, because there are pains in the necks in New Hampshire. We don't know when their date is actually going to be. Most believe it will be on January 23, but they won't set it for a while, maybe not until October, because that's New Hampshire. Remember, Trump is currently up by an average of 22 points in New Hampshire. Remember, this is a state where DeSantis had a double-digit lead over Trump in polls in January and largely frittered it away as he I think, waited for the campaign to come to him instead of putting a boot on Donald Trump's throat. I think the two to watch here, Justin, in my eyes, are Tim Scott, based on what he does in New Hampshire. Expectations right now aren't high for Scott. Maybe that changes after Iowa, but you've got a Southern religious conservative. New Hampshire's a world away from South Carolina. As you mentioned, polling shows it's the least religious state in the country, the opposite of Iowa. So if he could turn heads in New Hampshire, it's going to be a big deal for him. I think this is also make or break for Chris Christie. I think this is a shifts to the center of the table scenario for Christie. He announced his campaign in New Hampshire for a reason. In 2016, he did 100 town halls in the state. He's been unable to do that. We talked about the debate requirements, and I think that's really hampering a lower tier candidate like Christie, because instead of being able to run up and down the state doing town halls like he's really good at, he's been on cable news trying to get up to the 40,000 donor threshold. So I think the debate requirements really changes has changed the way candidates need to approach this election and hamper someone like Chris Christie, who really needs to rely on the grassroots to pull out an outcome that exceeds expectations.
I agree. And, look, we talked about the vice president's fundraising issues. He's got funding issues as well. I mean, he came in just over $1 million raised in his announcement quarter. We talked about he's running purportedly on a platform of got to stop Donald Trump from being president. The problem he's got is that he needs a lot of voters he needs voters who like Donald Trump a lot to be able to come and vote for him. I think it's a hard road for Governor Christie, which is why I said, like, we're going to, by the time we get to South Carolina, it's probably a 2-person race, and someone's got to perform in Iowa or New Hampshire or both to be able to make that happen. And this thing could be settled on the night of the South Carolina primary, one way or the other. Putting a lot on that one, but the stakes on this are huge. Because and we'll talk about this later, but we just went over the jigsaw puzzle. But after South Carolina is when you start getting into the several states on Tuesdays following, Super Tuesday states, where it is very little grassroots campaigning and 100% about having the most money as much money as possible to put on TV, to be able to get your message out there.
South Carolina is scheduled on the books for February 24. So once New Hampshire, gets around to scheduling their date, there will likely be a full month between New Hampshire and South Carolina. So South Carolina, to your point, is going to get a lot of attention over that month. There'll be a lot of candidates, because of what you said, who are going to be all in on South Carolina. It's a place where you can do retail politics. Media is cheaper than buying Boston TV, which covers most of New Hampshire. So South Carolinians are going to see a lot of candidates on the ground for that month. And it's going to be the last stand for a lot of candidates because, as you mentioned, Michigan's primary is 3 days after South Carolina. Idaho holds their caucus a few days after Michigan. And then 15 states have their primaries on March 5. And if you come up short in South Carolina after you put your chips to the center of the table, you're not going to have money for March 5. Because big
That's
states, right. California, Texas, I think North Carolina and Colorado, Massachusetts, these are all places where running campaigns, really running TV ads, are super expensive. And if you don't pull off a surprise or exceed expectations in South Carolina, you're out of money. This game is over.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we in 2012 was a little bit of a unicorn when Rick Santorum was able to hold on for so long and really be competitive in states, but he didn't have any money to be able to deliver that message or do anything with it. All right, time to wrap up. Thanks everyone for listening to the Yes Labels podcast. Again, subscribe, like, comment. We want to hear from everybody. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you next week.